Hello, and welcome back to another monthly conversation. I am joined here by my husband, Scott Young. I am Zorica, and this month we're talking about connections.
Yeah.
So, when we're talking about connections, obviously we mean focusing this month on our close relationships, our partners, or our children, um, parents,
Yeah.
friends, people that we want to connect with on a deeper level
Yeah.
and get a better understanding of the relationships and how we can deepen those relationships in general, right?
To also make more sense too, just for anyone who's come to this video randomly, they don't know what we're talking about. So this has been a year-long project called
Right.
Foundations. Each month focuses on a different foundation for life. So this is the 9th month. So we've been doing it for better part of a year now. And we previously in month 6 had a foundation I was calling outreach. And I kind of divided the relationships in your life into sort of the element that's more focused on being outgoing, socializing, being a part of a community, that element of relationships we covered in outreach. So we had a nice conversation about that a few months ago. We talked about Robert Putnam's work, and we talked about a lot of things related to making new friends, forming community ties, all of those sorts of things. And now this month is a little bit more focused on more intimate relationships, the relationships where you don't need to be an extrovert to be successful at it. You have to be a good communicator, a good listener, have good interpersonal habits. So this was the focus for this month. And yeah, we'll see how this conversation, I feel like there's more pressure now because we're like the subject of the talk as well. So hopefully everything will we'll be able to talk about all the stuff that we did this month and our marriage and our kids and all that sort of thing.
And we didn't really prep for it either.
No.
I asked you yesterday, like, how deep do you want to go?
Yeah.
How much do you want to talk about? And you're like, I don't know. So I read, obviously, every month,
Yeah.
Scott on his blog has been writing 3 separate posts about the topics.
Yeah.
For this month, you wrote an intro post, you wrote about some of the books that you were reading, and then you wrote your kind of closing post. So when I prep for these conversations, obviously I read those. I want to see how he's thinking about things, what he's writing about. You wrote about your strengths and weaknesses when it comes to close relationships.
Yeah.
I agreed with all of those. Okay,
so I was not wrong in my self-assessment. Okay.
I'll have some more to
So there's going to be some notes. We're going to start with the notes, everyone. All right. All right.
Why not?
Yeah,
Why not?
let's go. Okay.
And then we can kind of dive deeper and see, because you wrote a few things and in your weaknesses. And to be honest, personally, I think that these things, like, they don't really apply that much anymore. Like, I really do think that you've changed and you've grown.
Okay.
But you said something like alongside that you're a bad listener. And that you like to talk a lot and you like to interrupt. What? How did you? I mean, obviously, we know what our faults are, but you also said that you are not always patient. It's also kind of true.
Yeah.
And that you like to debate too much and
Also true.
voice your opinions.
Yeah.
Where they're not always welcomed or needed.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think I feel like, again, from the sort of, this is not something that changed overnight in this particular month, but over the long period of us dating, you do kind of sand off some of your rough edges. Like, you realize you're getting into certain doing certain things, certain behaviors that are like creating conflicts. They're like, okay, I'm going to like avoid that a little bit. I'm a talkative person. Like, certainly in these conversations, they sort of center on me a little bit narcissistically. And so, they're a little bit more dominated by my conversation. But I mean, in regular life, ideally, that's not the case. You want to have more back and forth. And I'm just a talkative person. I like to talk. And so even if it's about another person or I'm talking about their issues, I'm not the kind of, like, I don't think I would make a very good, like, therapist where you just sit there and let the other person talk for half an hour and then say, and I want to interject. I want to be like, okay, here's what I think about this. And so that's inhibiting that impulse, I think, has been a lifelong goal of mine, like a constant self-control challenge.
Yeah.
And then with patience, I do think just temperamentally, I have like, I get like kind of, I'll get frustrated over something, but it's very short term.
Yeah.
So I feel like some people, when they experience anger or frustration, it's like a slow build. And then, they hold grudges for a long time. It really simmers. Whereas for me, it really like, it lasts like a few seconds and then it's gone. And so it's more about in that moment, not, overreacting to that situation or not like letting it. But then I don't usually have a problem with, okay, this happened 3 weeks ago and I'm still stewing about it. I usually have a very short, like memory for those things. So I think it has a negative and a positive quality. And then for the debating thing, I don't know, maybe it's just the intellectual background of like having to write a lot and argue for viewpoints and this kind of thing. But I like having kind of intellectual sort of debates. But sometimes you realize you're talking to someone and they don't really want that kind of conversation. And then you're kind of already in the middle of it. And you're like, oh, we're actually, having an argument and I'm having fun, but they're like getting increasingly upset about this. So this has been something that I've also had to like learn over my years that, yeah, no, sometimes you just be like, that's a good opinion and just leave it at that. So yeah, definitely. I mean, we all have these sorts of things that even though we observe it in ourselves, like, oh, I know that I have this tendency. It is, not all, it's easier said than done to just like, oh, well, I won't do that again kind of thing. Right.
So some of your keystone habits that you kind of determined for this month is no phone at home while you're spending time with me or the kids, and also the count to 3 rule.
Yeah, that one didn't work out as well, but yeah. I have some thoughts on that, but I'll say that for the course itself or for the program itself, the one that I settled on was this not having the phone, not at home, like you have to go like drop it off in some mailbox somewhere, but just not having it at arm's length when you're having sort of time where you're trying to interact with people. And now, obviously, depending on your personal situation, this could be very different. So, I mean, we're now like you interact with people in the course, and there's some people who you live alone, right? So the idea of like not having your phone at home in order to connect with people doesn't necessarily make sense in that context. And it more looks like, okay, I'm going to have a conversation with someone, or I'm going to have an interaction with someone, I'm going to put it away and not talk with them. Whereas I think if you're like us and you have a partner, maybe you have kids or you live with your parents or something like this, just having some time where you're in the house and you don't have your phone with you, I think is valuable, because certainly that's been the most dramatic change to our conversational lives, is that in the last 10, 15 years, conversations have increasingly shifted towards text. So people text and send emails, and real conversations, especially ones where you're not actively engaged in a topic, it's very easy to be like, well, there's a bit of a lull, let's look at my phone. And that often robs you of that space to like, talk about more deep or interesting things. And like we talked about, like having that moments of silence, I think was very important in our early relationship. And that's something that increasingly is harder to get as, okay, let's fill this with something entertaining or something that I can look at, right?
Yeah. In your book list, you said you read the book You're Not Listening.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that book. And do you think that it helped with the understanding of the importance of listening?
Well, so I think it was interesting because, first of all, if you just sort of step back, it's kind of interesting that our emphasis on communication, like if you go to like a bookstore and they have maybe a section on like books that are related to communication skills, they're invariably about speaking. They're invariably about persuading. How do you talk? How do you present yourself? Like there's so many books on like how to be a great speaker, a great persuader, a negotiator. And there's relatively little attention paid to listening. And so some of that is, it's kind of embarrassing, because in a lot of our relationships, the listening side of things is more important. For sure. Certainly for things like negotiation and persuasion. I mean, I'm not a salesperson by trade, but I've read a lot about sales and the profession. And what I've read is that like a lot of people think the stereotype of the really good salesperson is like they've got the catchy slogans and they're kind of, it's this sort of slick alpha male kind of thing. And the truth of it is that the best salespeople are just really good listeners. Like they just really listen to someone and they're like, oh, you want this? Oh yeah, we have that thing. And and so it's not the person who's like trying to make quota and they're trying to push upon you something that you don't actually want, but someone who really takes the time to listen and you feel like, oh, they heard me. They know what I want. And so it's kind of interesting, this discrepancy between what really matters in practice and what is taught. And so Kate Murphy's book, You're Not Listening, is it's one of those journalistic books where she like covers listening from like all these different topics and goes through all these interviews. So it's less of a like, there's one strong central thesis that binds it. But I think the thing that I took as my overall takeaway from it is that being a good listener is mostly about motivation rather than skill. So it's mostly about, most people can be a good listener when they really care to listen. It's when they don't really care to listen, they want to make their own point, or they are thinking about something else, or they're just not that interested in the conversation, where people are bad listeners. So this is a kind of good news, bad news thing. Like the good news about it is that there isn't like some skill that you really need to master the way that maybe you would need to master a skill if you wanted to be a good public speaker or a debater, where, you really do need to practice something that's unusual for you. But on the flip side, it's like you already know what to do. So the obstacle is, interacting with someone, paying attention to them, being engaged. And if you find that hard to do, like there's no magic bullet. You have to actually do the work. So I thought that was an interesting book for that point among many that she made about listening.
Yeah. And in the book Reclaiming Conversation, you also read about how we struggle with having meaningful conversations these days, especially with everybody having phones, and like you said, we only communicate by texting. We don't really even call each other anymore. So when people go out and sit down to have a normal in-person conversation, they struggle with that, right?
Yeah.
So what did you?
This is an interesting one. So this is Sherry Turkle. She is I don't know that she's still with MIT, but she was an MIT sociologist, and she did a lot of work on like human computer interaction over the decades. So she is sort of working in the field of cognitive science, but like looking at it from the lens of how do people interact with these things. And her basic thesis is that this emerging communication technology has really deteriorated our ability to have naturalistic conversations, and that those conversations are important and valuable. So very directly to the point of the Keystone Habit about not having your phone with you when you're having a conversation. So some of the like interesting research is that even having a phone nearby, so like within arm's reach, lowers the quality of like conversation people have. Like people feel that their conversational partner is less attentive, which is not mystical. It's just that when your phone is nearby, there's this kind of like, oh, maybe there's something on it. You're kind of like doing this and you're not fully paying attention. And so I think the book was interesting too, because we are millennials, and there's a little bit of a generational divide. Like I have no problem calling people on the phone, and now I'm realizing as you start interacting with younger people that that's weird for some people, that if you're like, why didn't you text me? Like, why are you calling me on the phone? And she documents in this book all these interviews that she does with with younger people, with kind of Gen Z and this kind of stuff. And there's a lot of people who are just like absolutely terrified to have a phone conversation with someone that they don't know. And they, really prefer the sort of safety of pre-composing things in email and text messages, because like they can't express themselves if they're just having conversation, because conversations are improvisational and you have to react spontaneously to things. And those are seen as drawbacks, but they're really strengths, because when you have to respond spontaneously, there's a certain authenticity that comes with that too, because you can't, okay, wait, what's the right way to respond to this? Especially you think about dating.
Tell me how to.
Yeah. Like if you're thinking about dating, like the difference between having a face-to-face encounter with someone where like you are automatically going to have, facial responses, body language, your immediate reaction to things is going to be apparent. Whereas if you're, doing this over text conversations, like a lot of people who do online dating now, you can kind of like workshop, okay, what's the exact thing to say in this thing to get it, it's kind of phony in a way. And so I really like Turkle's book because she's sort of exposing how changing technology is um, making these dramatic shifts in how we communicate with each other, and not always to the better.
Yeah. And what about in the anatomy of marital happiness? Do you think that married people are happier than single people?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, this was an interesting paper. I'm blanking a little bit on the author name right now, but the paper looked at general social survey data. So this is the U.S. does these general social surveys, which gather data on lots of different points, and they have these broad surveys, and so they're kind of useful from a sociological or psychometric point of view, because normally if you do an experiment, you can only get like a small sample size, and it's often a convenience sample. So if you think about like most psychology work, it's like undergraduate students who are trying to get their like course credit. And so it's just not necessarily generalizable to society as a whole. And so you've got all these issues with that. And then also, if you're going to run a big survey, it's very expensive, and you can only collect so much data. You can only collect, you're not necessarily going to collect all the data that you might want to sort of correlate with this. So this general social survey data is a real treasure trove for figuring out like what Americans in particular are like. And one of the interesting findings from this is that there is a question about happiness in the general social survey. And I don't know the exact wording of the text, but it has not changed over the last decade. So they've been asking the same question to people for decades about, in general, how happy are you with your life? And I think the responses are like very happy, somewhat happy, and like not very happy. And I think basically the author of this paper took the very happy and minus the not very happy, taking the middle one as a kind of ambivalent response, and sort of that number, that percentage of people. And the sort of surprising thing that comes out of this is that married people are in general quite a bit happier than unmarried people by about 30 percentage points. And that this fact about this one question holds pretty much regardless of what you control it for. So it doesn't matter whether it's men or women. It doesn't matter whether they're gay or straight. It doesn't matter whether they are, rich or poor, educated, uneducated. And it's a dramatic contrast. So like the thing that comes out from the data is that if you look at income deciles, so like people who are in the top 10% of income, which I believe in the United States, when they were looking at the latest survey, was, I want to say it was like around $260,000 a year. Whereas the poorest decile for, this is household income, by the way, this is not individual income, but household income is like $260,000 a year. And then the poorest was like $18,000 a year. So, kind of like toward the poverty line, at least in the United States, according to many definitions. And so the difference between the richest 10% and the poorest 10% in terms of happiness is about the same between married and unmarried people, which is pretty dramatic. And it turns out that this is still true even if you take into account like cohabiting partners are happier than single people, but they're not as happy as married people. So there's something like unique about marriage that makes I shouldn't say makes people happier, but that is a correlated with them being happier. So this is like a very kind of interesting finding that to me was rather unexpected. I wasn't thinking this would be obviously the case, or that it would be such a strong, robust relationship that is not mediated by one of these other variables.
Well, especially because when you're looking at movies and they're, or I don't know.
Yeah, stereotypes and
The
stuff.
stereotype of a marriage is always like, oh, my ball and chain, or marriage is so hard, or and also, I don't know, what is the statistic of divorce, like 50%
like 50%
of marriages, but isn't it like, yes, 50% of marriages get divorced, but then there's people that just get divorced multiple times, so they kind of skew it a little.
So it's 50% of marriages, but because some people get married like 7 times and get divorced 7 times, there's a skewness to the distribution. So the like chance that you yourself will be divorced, assuming like this is your first marriage, it is lower than 50%.
Yes.
But it is still quite high. And I think it is an interesting question though about this data, because I think I don't want to say optimistic conclusion, but at least the more like practical conclusion would be, well, being married makes you happier. So like this should be a life goal that everyone has. But I tend to believe almost the opposite direction of causality is maybe more important,
Happy
that
people get
people
married.
who are happier are more likely to not only get married but stay married.
Right.
So if you are someone who is like, dour or neurotic, or you have something really negative going on in your life, it
Yeah.
will also influence your chances of sustaining your marriage, which is also something that I think is a kind of that's a more pessimistic conclusion, but I think it's possible. Like I was reading one of the textbooks I read this month, I think it was called Intimate Relationships by Ronald Miller. And he talks about kind of time series data. So this is not the same data set. This is not like the General Social Survey, which is like this cross-sectional snapshot. This is looking at individuals, tracking them over time and asking them their reported happiness. And what you see is that people get kind of happier as they're about to get married, and then they stay happier a few years after they get married. So there's this bump that lasts maybe like 5 to 7 years, but people eventually return to their baseline, which I think is consistent with a lot of other social scientific work. So, I mean, these are just two studies and the methodologies are different. So I don't want to like make some particular claim, but that is a little bit of like one tick on the side of happier people are more likely to have stable marriages than the reverse, that getting married is more likely to make you stably happy. But
So
still, yeah.
are you happier now that you're married to me than before?
Oh yeah.
Have you like gone back to
Yeah.
the
No, I keep going up and up. I'm the exception to the rule, guys. No, I think I do feel like we have a particularly good relationship. And I think with marriage, I think there is some heterogeneity in like how much you enjoy your marriage, and I feel like I'm lucky, or in some way that, I feel like ours has been good, and I feel like we've gotten better over time. Whereas I think some people definitely, there's a honeymoon phase and then there's a back down to reality. And indeed, that was one of the things that came up again in this Miller textbook, was that the couples that tend to do the worst in terms of like marital satisfaction and happiness are those that have this kind of maybe unrealistic expectation about it. So they sort of have this like, they're super passionate and excited about this person, and then they want that sort of intense feeling to last forever.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like, because, especially building off of our friendship and this kind of thing, we've always had a little bit more of a companionate marriage that has been more grounded in friendship and that love. I think that just gets stronger. So that's, I think, maybe a more firm foundation for a marriage. Oh, yeah.
You're still like, I still feel like you're my best friend.
Yeah.
And I'm really happy with our relationship.
I'm
I
very happy
think
too.
honestly, I think about that a lot too. I think a lot of people, and I think this is normal, and it happens that when they're in a long-term relationship, they start to, and that kind of butterfly feeling sort of goes away.
Yeah.
They start to build a lot of resentment towards their partner. They start to create these stories in their head about their partner, and oh, they said this and that, and they kind of, it escalates.
Yeah.
And it's all mostly in their head. Like me, I mean, I'm not speaking for anyone here, and I'm just kind of sharing my opinion, but I think that happens a lot. And then they also, I think what a lot of people don't do is they don't talk a lot about what, or they don't think a lot about what their true values are in the dating phase, how they want to live their life. Do they want to travel a lot? Do they want to have kids? Do they want to be married? All those things, I think that sometimes they're not discussed in detail, and then you get married, and then it just kind of, that feeling sticks around of, I don't, I don't, we don't have the same values, right? And then the same problems keep coming back and back, and then there is no resolution. And then, I don't know, a lot of people also always complain that they don't have enough intimacy in their relationships. But I don't think that just kind of happens I
Yeah.
think that happens because of many other reasons as well, of a lot of resentment, I think.
But I think it also goes to how you communicate and how you have conflict. So, maybe not jumping ahead too far in your notes here, but
Whatever you're
the book, John Gottman book, Why Marriages
right.
Succeed or
Yeah,
Fail, was
that's
one
what
of
I
the
was
readings I
gonna ask
did. Now,
you.
John Gottman has done research over decades on spousal conflict. So he
Hmm.
gets like husband and wives to like sit down in some room and like puts on like pressure cuffs and like heart rate monitors and all this kind of stuff, and puts all these cameras, and then just like asks them to like talk about a recent disagreement they had, and then really intensively documents the following fight that inevitably
Okay,
develops when
that
they get
sounds
to
so
do it.
uncomfortable. Oh my gosh.
Apparently I thought the funny thing about him talking about this is that he was worried that like all this apparatus would like make it artificial, but apparently people completely forget that they're in this situation and they just talk normally and frankly like pretty soon after. And what I thought was interesting about his discussion of it, and I mean we can get more into the research as well, but it seems like how someone handles conflict is an extremely strong predictor of whether their marriage is going to be successful. So he was saying that like based on his like scoring of how he figures this out, he can predict whether a couple will stay together to like it's like 94% accuracy. I don't know remember the exact figure, but it's very high. So it suggests that this little snapshot of this is how you guys have fights together um, is just this incredibly potent window into the relationship. Because I agree with you, compatibility is very important. Like if you have basic value differences, you know, you want kids, she doesn't, you like to travel, he wants to stay at home, like you have very basic disagreements, there will be more conflicts. But I think anytime you have any two people, there's going to be places where you agree and places where you disagree. And so how you get those disagreements and resolve them, or at least get them to a state where both parties are like satisfactory with that outcome, I think is a huge part of it. And so I think for a lot of people, they struggle with handling conflict. They don't know how to express themselves. They don't know how to like like listen, this kind of thing. And so I think how handling disagreements well seems to be a major factor. And this also relates to, again, the previous point we were talking about maybe certain temperaments or certain types of people who are naturally happier being um, more likely to be in stable marriages. So if you look at personality inventory, so the big five in psychology, ocean, openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The people who have successful marriages, it's not about compatibility here. It's about having a certain personality profile. And so people who are like low in neuroticism and high in agreeableness have better marriages than those who don't. And so this makes sense because if you are an agreeable person, you are, by kind of definition, by temperament, trying to resolve conflicts, trying to lower the heat on things, trying to, okay, here's how we can reconcile this disagreement. Whereas if you're someone who's just sort of stubborn and you're constantly getting in fights, it's a different thing. And then neuroticism is, I think, related to like how easygoing you are, how much are there things that are going to like disturb you psychologically that come up in your everyday life. So I don't think if you are a disagreeable, somewhat neurotic person, you can't have a successful relationship.
It's gonna
But
have to be a very agreeable partner.
well, I don't, sometimes that's the case, but I think it's more that if you recognize, oh, I have these tendencies, like even me recognizing that I have this tendency to like enjoy debating people. I don't think I'm a particularly disagreeable person by nature, but that is a habit in that direction. And, attenuating that, personality specific habit has probably been good for our relationship and
I
my
Yeah,
friendships and
'cause
stuff.
I like listening to you. And I'm also, well, I
Yeah.
okay, I'll say one of my weaknesses I feel like
Mm.
is that I can be like quite particular about certain things.
No, no, no. Just okay.
Okay, moving
No.
on.
No.
The one thing I wanted to talk to you about for the
Yeah.
previous topic about the communication
Yeah.
styles. I wanted you to give an example because I think this is going to be really helpful.
Yeah.
How do we express our feelings while also taking responsibility for them?
Yeah.
Right? Because you can feel a certain way and you can be like, "Oh, you made me feel that way." And then the other person is becoming defensive and is
Yeah.
like, "Oh, I didn't mean that." How do you express something? Um and then but also, okay, this is how I'm feeling, and then the argument can be more quickly resolved.
Yeah, so I think just to speak about it more generally, at first, I think the idea here is that, and this was something that, in retrospect makes sense, but kind of surprised me a little bit when I was reading it, is that conflicts are actually good in a marriage or in a relationship. Like the idea that, oh, the best marriage is one where like you never have any fights or disagreements is not necessarily true, because then what's usually happening is that there are disagreements, but people are just sort of swallowing it and maybe building some resentment because they don't feel like they can communicate and come to it. So bringing up things you're not satisfied with in your relationship is actually a very healthy behavior, but you have to do it the right way, because a lot of times, again, you are saying, you did this thing, you made me feel this way, you're doing this. And like, obviously, if you just apply a little bit of common sense, whenever you're doing that, the person is immediately going to be defensive. They're immediately going to be like, well, you're attacking me, so I need to like justify why I'm doing the right thing, why you're overreacting, this kind of thing. And then, it creates this escalating cycle. So and John Gottman talks a lot about it in his book, but one book that I felt like took this philosophy of like, how do you communicate in a way that really avoids this problem of attacking the other person, or trying to, in some ways, like make them feel bad or coerce them or this kind of thing, was Marshall Rosenberg's nonviolent communication. And so he talks a lot about like how you can reframe what you're saying to talk about, I'm trying to express my needs. I'm trying to take responsibility for my feelings. So it's not like you are causing them. I'm
feeling this way.
I am the source of this.
Right.
But expressing my needs in such a way that you are more likely to voluntarily want to help me with this. So it's sort of like, instead of like, oh, you never listen to me, it's like, well, when you're on your phone, I feel like I'm not being heard and I need that to connect with you. So would you be able to put your phone away? Is like a much nicer way to do that than like, get off your phone, I'm trying to talk to you right now. Like you can see how that latter one would be like, I had something important to look at. Like you immediately get into justification mode, which sometimes makes the conflict worse. So I think this is a big part of how to have this sort of successful communication. Although it was interesting to note in Gottman's research that, we don't all have to be like perfect diplomats to have successful marriages. He noted that there were 3 relationship styles that were successful. So the sort of one that I would say is like classically recognized as good is the validating style, which I would say is our style, where you express your disagreements and you come to compromises and you express yourself. But he found that, in fact, people who have the passionate style, where they are they fight a lot and they kind of are somewhat mean to each other, but they're also very loving to sort of compensate for that negativity in their fights, those people actually can have successful marriages too. And so can people who are like more, let sleeping dogs lie. Like they don't bring up stuff, they don't get into fights, but they're both okay with it. They're both like, you know what, this isn't worth having a fight over it. And they tend to be less passionate, more even keeled, and but they have a good partnership. And you know what, I'm not gonna touch that one. And I think that's interesting as well, because I think sometimes, if you naturally trend towards some sort of style, you might feel like, oh, I have to be this totally opposite person to have a successful relationship. And at least Gottman's research says that that's not the case.
Yeah. And then on the opposite of that, what do you think are the kind of 4 horsemen of relationship malcontent?
Yes. So this is from Gottman's research. And so he had complaining, defensiveness, stonewalling, and criticism is maybe the first one. Criticism? No,
it's
criticism. Yeah.
Criticism, defensiveness.
No, not complaining. Criticism, defensiveness.
Contempt.
Contempt. That was another C. I missed it. Yeah, here.
And stonewalling.
Yeah, complaining is not bad. Complaining is what I was talking about, like bringing up something that dissatisfies you. Whereas criticism is taking something, this dissatisfies me, and it's your fault, right?
Yeah.
That's a criticism. Whereas contempt is, I'm dissatisfied this and it's your fault. And also you're an idiot. Like you're trying to like attack this person, right? So that's a worse form of criticism. Like criticism is saying it's your fault, and contempt is where I'm going to try to make you feel bad because I want you to feel bad about this as well.
Yeah.
Part of this conflict resolution, that sometimes you need to bring up complaints, but the more you can bring up complaints in a way that like is like I'm dissatisfied with this situation versus I'm dissatisfied with you
Right.
is less likely to provoke the other horseman, which is defensiveness, which is where you disengage from resolving the problem because I'm being attacked. So I need to defend myself. I need to show why you're wrong and why, you're overreacting, this kind of thing. And it's also unhealthy for the relationship. And stonewalling, the last one, is where someone just feels overwhelmed by the fighting, so they just disengage. Like, I'm not going to talk to you. I'm going to ignore you. So the classic example, and this is a bit of a stereotype, but he finds it's true in the research, is that men tend to be more stonewallers and women tend to be more defensive. And so the stonewalling tends to look like, hey, you're doing this and you're doing this. And then I'm just like, I'm going to ignore you. I'm just like, I'm going to go off my day because I don't want to deal with it.
Yeah.
And that's a really negative trait because it tends to make the other person more critical, more complaint. Like they're doing more to try to provoke the other person and the other person is shutting them out. And what I thought was interesting from this is that, like, I think when you conceptualize someone stonewalling in a relationship, you're viewing it as a little bit like, they can't be bothered, right? But what's really happening is because again, he's got these blood pressure cuffs and all this kind of stuff on his subjects, is that when someone is stonewalling, they're feeling a very strong stress reaction to the situation. So they are feeling very stressed out. You're creating a lot of negativity and they can't process it, they can't handle that. So they're just going to walk away from the situation. So the right way to deal with it is that you need to lower the heat. You need to make it easier to like bring this person back to communicating. And often people do the opposite. They start insulting, they start raising the temperature because they're trying to provoke a reaction. And so I thought that was very interesting that, like, a lot of these bad relationship communication habits, they're kind of like a vicious cycle that, you start off with a complaint that edges into a criticism, which causes defensiveness, which causes some contempt, which causes stonewalling. Like it gets worse and worse and worse. And what Gottman finds is that, if you assess a person's overall relationship, the ratio of positivity to negativity is extremely important. That successful marriages are about 5-1, positive to negative. And once you start tipping below that, so that you're less than 5-1 in your ratio, even going to like 1-1 or less,
in 5 interactions,
like five like negative, like 5 positive comments to a negative comment,
Okay.
right? So if I'm saying, averaged out over a long period of time, as this trend goes more negative, again, it creates this vicious cycle where it doesn't support the relationship. So I think this is a kind of an interesting principle in general, that negativity weighs more than positivity for the same thing. I think we talked about this a little bit in the productivity month about like progress, that there's this book called The Progress Principle, where if you're thinking about it in context of employees, that like you need every setback is worth 3 like progress. So in terms of employee morale, every time you like, yeah, great job, great job, great job, oh, not so good job, like that balances out even though it's 3-1. And so similarly, I thought that was interesting that, having those fights, having those really negative encounters just weigh so much more strongly than the I love yous and the, caresses and this kind of stuff, that, if you're a couple that does fight a lot, then you have to be like really loving and caring to make up for the sort of neatness of the fights. Yeah, a lot of passion to make up for those fights. And so I think that's what happens, is that if the ratio gets skewed, then just naturally you go down this vicious circle of, negative feeling and hurt feelings, and it creates conflict.
Yeah. We kind of went deep into these questions. So I have sort of, as a break, I have these kind of rapid fire questions that I thought were interesting.
Okay. Lightning round.
Yes, exactly. Your opinion.
Okay.
Should people live together before they get married?
Well, so I personally, from my culture, believe that that's a good idea, but it was interesting to note that from the research, that is negatively correlated with success in relationship outcomes. So I'm not sure whether that's because people who tend to get married before they live together come from more conservative backgrounds. And so if you're of a more conservative culture, that's more likely that you're going to be in a stable marriage. But Miller's conclusion from the textbook where he reviewed the research was that something about living together maybe sort of it kind of deflates some of the maybe motivation to get married, and maybe it kind of resets these expectations.
Then
So he was
mates, and then you're like,
yeah, he was a little bit more skeptical of it. So I know that isn't really like a lightning fast answer, but I thought that was a surprising finding from the research.
Okay. So we lived together for like a year,
Yeah.
but we moved in together and immediately got engaged and then got married.
But we did live together.
We
It
lived
wasn't, yeah.
together
Yeah.
for a little bit of time. Why do most marriages fail? Why do you think?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about before. I think marriages tend to fail because of conflict resolution, or like this increasing negativity that happens when you fail to resolve conflicts in a way that makes each other happy.
Okay. And who do you think is more romantic about their beliefs about relationships, men or women?
Yeah, so this is one of the ones that also came from the textbook, that we tend to, like, culturally stereotype women as being romantic and men as being sort of like logical or practical. But if you actually like inventory their beliefs about relationships, men are more romantic than women. So men have more fantasies about like love at first sight, and they tend to be more emotional in their decision making about who they partner with. And women are much more willing to like be pragmatic and be like, well, you know, he's not maybe the most attractive person I've ever dated, but we get along really well, and like this is a good reason. Whereas men would be like, no, they must be perfect in all dimensions. So I just thought it was very funny that this is an area where, like, if you do the research, actually men are the ones who are the, you know, they should be the ones who are like falling for these stories about the perfect,
The
yeah,
princess fairy tales.
yeah, the princess fairy tales, yeah.
And do you think playing hard to get works?
Yeah. So, I mean, there is a logic behind it, which is that if you are playing, you know, if you're seen as being, you know, very easily to, you know, fall in love, very easy to date, then maybe you're not going to be as committed to the partner. But when they do research of like what people are actually interested in, it's not that you are hard to get with that particular person, but that you are hard to get with everyone else. So I think that's one of the things where advice can mislead, because it's partly true that you don't want to be, you know, seen as someone who, you know, very easily falls in love with everyone, because then maybe if you fall in love with everyone, it's not going to be as significant when you fall in love with this person. But at the same time, if you are sort of acting aloof and distant and different to that person, people find that less attractive in both men and women. So this is something that seems to be a kind of general truth about human nature. And I think it was one of the things that revealed that, like, you know, there are differences between genders, certainly with regards to dating and relationships, but there's more similarities than maybe we give credit for too.
What is your advice to someone wanting to improve their relationship?
Well, I think spending more time listening is very important, because I think the resolution of all the conflicts that you're going to have are going to come from really understanding the other person. And very often we jump to what we think that that person should do or think, and we don't spend enough time trying to understand their perspective.
I like that. And what is your advice to someone seeking a long-term relationship?
Well, I think I think the way that you find a long-term relationship is that you live the best life that you can, and you be the best kind of person who would be a good partner to someone else. And I think that a lot of times there's a outward focus on dating, of like it's about other people, as opposed to, you know, being the kind of person that other people would want to partner with. And that's, I think, the starting point for that.
I like that.
Mm.
I always believe that, I
Yeah.
think. I think more so than you. So at this point of our interview, to those of you who are new here, watching or listening, this is our 9th conversation, which means there are 8 more of these types of conversations on this channel. So some of the topics are fitness, productivity, money, food, reading, outreach, sleep, reflections. So please go and watch these episodes. And if you're not a subscriber, please subscribe so you don't miss any of the upcoming conversations that we will have in the next few months.
Yeah. And the next month is going to be on focus. So this one we're going to be talking about how do you divert that resource of your life, your attention, onto the work and things that matter to you most.
Yeah. So hopefully these are helpful conversations and you enjoy them. And please subscribe. And yeah, we'll be back here
Next month.
next month.
Take care.